Now, the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, has approved the setting up of 3 free schools run by Christian groups which hold creationist views. Many scientists are at the forefront of a campaign against such schools. They argue that the state should not be funding groups who dispute accepted scientific theory like evolution. But with many parents seeking to send their children to such faith schools, shouldn't the parents have the right to choose? The British Humanist Association, which opposes all faith schools, says any teaching of creationism is unacceptable in a state-funded school in the 21st century. Creationism is the belief that God created the universe. Some Christians, Muslims and Jews believe in a literal 6-day creation, as in Genesis, and reject the idea of a Big Bang creating the universe over billions of years. But others have a more allegorical view. And some say that evolution, the theory first put forward by Charles Darwin, is part of God's plan. But some creationists emphasise evolution is only a theory and regard creationism as a valid alternative which should be taught not just in religious education classes but in science. Many atheists and scientists are appalled at this idea, saying science teaching must be based on the mainstream consensus, not faith. Under government rules on setting up free schools, creationism can't be taught in science. So if it's taught only in RE, where is the harm? Is it allowing children to make up their own minds? So is it dangerous to allow children to be taught in schools run by creationists? Or has society evolved to a point where all such viewpoints can and should be debated in schools? Well, if you've a webcam, you can make your point on Skype or join the conversation on Twitter, phone, text or email. The details are all on the screen. Now, George, let's start with facts, because you're a creationist, aren't you? And you did try to set up a school. So, I mean, what level of creationist? Literally 6 days, evolution
Let me tell you what I believe. I believe in a God that is non-contingent, doesn't need anything to be God. Creation and evolution. Evolution takes lots of time, not a lot of God, maybe no God, according to the humanists. And creation needs lots of God and a little bit of time, or maybe no time. I'm on that side of the argument. And this is why it's a great way to get people engaged in science.
What happened with... You've dropped your plan to set up a school. Why?
I asked David Cameron personally, back in 2010, are you going to allow me to teach creation in science class? He squirmed and told me to speak to Michael Gove. I spoke to Michael Gove.
Well, you can't do that, can you? So that's the reason you dropped it?
Yeah, I can't do it. And
actually, it's not science.
No, hang on. Have a listen to what I'm about to say. You can engage, and I have done. I used to run a school for 8 years. Engage children in the question about time. Because this is the thing that these two theories have in common. One has a lot of time, one has a little bit of time. Can God, who does not...
Let's have the discussion about whether creationism is in science.
You see, time was what...
Why can't you just teach it in RE and accept that it's not considered scientific fact?
The fact is, I can give you 100 scientists, and listen to the creationist website, PhDs, doctorates, professors. I think you've got somebody on the webcam who will say, actually, we have a perspective on this. And science has always been about the contestation of arguments. And when government starts to say, whether it be creation or something else, you cannot teach this in science, you do science harm. James, you do science real harm.
James, your kids go to a Catholic faith school. This is just a different faith.
I went to a Catholic school as well, I think, but possibly more relevantly, I was taught biology and the theory of natural selection by a Benedictine monk, and so it hadn't undermined or particularly damaged his faith, but he didn't believe that the world was conjured out of nothingness in 6 days, and on the 7th day God rested. He saw the Old Testament as at best analogous, as something that we can use as a model to live by. And the reason why it's important to teach science in science and analogies in religious instruction classes is this: you're opening the door to literalism and fundamentalism. If you want to argue that every single word in the Old Testament is sound and is historical fact and is the code by which we as Christians must live, then you're doing that thing we all are familiar with. You're opening the door to the whole of Leviticus, to slavery, to homophobia, to not eating shellfish, to not being allowed to touch animal skins.
The problem with biblical literalism is that, first of all, it worries me because it has a certain element of evangelism about it. It's too kind of over-enthusiastic. Second of all, the great minds who study Christian scholarship, rabbinic scholarship, don't actually fundamentally know whether, when God created the world in 6 days, what a day meant. We're only giving it a human interpretation in the same way that science articulates the beauty of creation. It's there, but science explains it, if you like. So 6 days could mean 6 epochs of time. Maimonides, the great rabbinic philosopher, said there will be men who will know all about science and there will be men who know all about religion, but men who only know about both know about everything. The men that know about only one don't know anything. I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive.
George, there's religious difference about interpretation. So why would you want to bring that into a science class?
You see, the thing is, science and education is about enabling people to flourish as human beings by questioning things. And what the government have done here is set a precedent of saying, you may not ask this question in a science class. And what's going to be the next question you can't ask in a science class? It's not
the next thing that's not science. Can we teach French in a science class? Did it say no to that as well, George?
We're talking about teaching a language. We're talking about people...
Well, you're talking about teaching a myth.
You're talking about scientists who have written theses, got their doctorates about creation. They're scientists. They've got the
evolution is a demonstrable fact. Evolution is a demonstrable fact.
Hang on.
It can be proven, and that's what science is about.
You're talking about two kinds of science. The science of origins and the science that you can actually demonstrate. I can demonstrate if you put phosphorus in water, it will explode.
Yes, that's science.
That's science.
Yes.
And then you've got the science of origin.
Yes, that's not science.
Nobody was there.
Yes, so that's not science.
That's fake.
No, but it happened. It happened.
What did?
How can you prove it?
You can't prove it, but you can.
And it's not science.
So everything that cannot be proved cannot be discussed in a scientific way. You couldn't prove.
That's the fundamental tenet of science.
You couldn't prove until somebody proved it that you could split an atom. So does that mean we couldn't split an atom? No, it needed people.
You couldn't articulate it.
No, you couldn't prove it. You needed scientists to grapple with
George,
the idea.
your point is that it's all scientific argument is the same as theological argument.
No, it's not the same. But what I'm saying, there's a place.
The principle of argument.
Argument, and the place for
But you're going to be telling children, wouldn't you, in a school that this is the fact? Surely, as a creationist, that's what you believe. Wouldn't you promote that as fact?
In our REs, we will take the Bible as fact. In our science, we are now, as if we take the creation of a tree as a fact, we will now... may I speak?
Sorry.
We will now unpack it in a scientific argument. And there are scientists out there doing it.
Well,
and what Michael Gove has said is that those scientists cannot have a voice in the classroom. And that is wrong. That's a civil liberties matter.
All right, well, can I just bring in a contributor on webcam here? We have James Williams, who is a lecturer in science education. At the moment, these free schools, despite what George wants, can only teach creationism in RE, not in science. Is that enough? I mean, there's no problem, is there, as long as the law remains as it is for you?
Well, the problem that you've got is not what's being taught or where it's being taught, it's how it's being taught. And I think the problem that George has is he's mixing up what science is and what religion is. Science is about the explanation of the natural world. It does not consider the metaphysical. It doesn't consider the supernatural. And you've got to remember that when you start undermining the theory of evolution, as I think may well happen in these creationist schools, it then leads to children, I believe it's an intellectual abuse of children. You end up with children not understanding science. You end up with children not being able to articulate what is the central tenet of biology. And I think that the creationist schools, and certainly the six-day biblical creationists, are more harmful to religion than atheism or any other form of anti-Christianity.
I can present PhD holders in science who have gone through a creationist education. What you're saying, James, with respect, is incorrect. It's not
PhD has been conferred on them by scientists.
Yes, by scientists in Warwick University. Yeah, but what he's saying is that there's an abuse that happens if you have creationist teaching that makes them somehow not able to articulate science.
That's what James is saying.
I know people with PhDs that can't tie their own shoelaces. It's not a qualification of infallibility.
No, we're talking about science here. And James, if I've misunderstood you, correct me, but James is seeming to argue that if we teach creation in a science class, it will somehow muddle that person up and they will not be able to articulate or grapple with science. Children become adults. And I can give you names and addresses of children who have become adults, who have become scientists and gone to not creationist universities, Warwick, Oxford, and got PhDs, and they've gone through this because what happens?
Could I just come back here very quickly?
They start to think and grapple.
Okay, James, go ahead, James.
Okay. You can't just turn around and say, I can name 100 scientists. In America, yes, they've got biblical scientists, and they've said, we've got a list of 600 PhD scientists who believe that evolution is very dodgy and that creationism is correct. In America, they created a list, and you could only join that list if you're a scientist called Steve or Stephen or something like that, and they immediately had thousands. So it's not a question of numbers, it's actually a question of mixing up the natural with the supernatural.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, but if you have children in a classroom, children are very impressionable, you implant a misconception about science in a child, and as a teacher I can tell you it's almost impossible to remove that misconception. And creationism is a misconception.
James, I want to bring in another contributor on webcam, which is Professor Andy McIntosh, who's a professor of thermodynamics at Leeds University. Now, you are a scientist, but I think you also support George's position. Now, scientific consensus is central to how science education works. Shouldn't creationism be kept in church?
Thank you, Samira. Actually, I'm a co-director of Truth
Sorry,
and Science,
it's Professor Michael Rice, is
who I'm
it?
speaking for. I am also a professor at Leeds, as you rightly said. Basically, you've got to follow where the evidence leads, Samira. You cannot, as your previous caller, James Williams, was suggesting, suddenly bar Christians. Christians have believed in the Bible for centuries, and they represent actually the ethos of a whole vast tranche of people who aren't necessarily Christians, but to accept that you've got to allow a genuine debate, following where the evidence leads in the science classroom, and obviously in the religious knowledge classroom. It goes without saying that when it comes to Christianity, you teach what the Bible says. What the Bible says, and the Bible speaks about creation.
Thank you. Professor Rice, thank you. Apologies for the confusion on our technical side there, but we have Professor Andy McIntosh now. Now, you are a creationist, and you are a professor. Can someone correct me which way round? Is this Andy McIntosh? That I can see now.
I'm not sure who you're looking at. Are you looking at me at the moment?
Right. Professor Andy McIntosh, could you say hello to me, please?
Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm sorry, I had some confusion in my ear. Have you just been speaking, or was I speaking to Professor Rice?
I was just speaking.
Fantastic, right. Well, I mean, having heard what Professor McIntosh has said, I mean, Andy, what's your response?
Can I just say, we're talking about the Christian teaching of the Bible. As a Jewish woman, can I say I absolutely, the central fulcrum of our faith is the Bible, is the Old Testament, and it talks about creation. That doesn't negate scientific teaching. We don't know literally what the teaching of what the words of the Bible mean. Greater minds than ours, greater beings than ours may have created the world. Who says how many days 6 days actually constitutes? It doesn't mean, as a Jewish person, as an Orthodox Jewish girl who believes in the Bible, who is very strongly upholding her faith, absolutely wants to negate any kind of scientific rationale in the world. I just see it as the way that we articulate the work of God. And I would be appalled if my children, who I'm bringing up as Orthodox Jewish children, were not allowed to consider all the possibilities that science brings. Science may demand proof. Science may demand proof, but the fact is that it articulates maybe what creation does. It does not sit as something that goes beyond the creationist argument. The two are inextricably woven.
All right, I want to very briefly bring in Professor Michael Rice. Apologies for the confusion we've had. You're an educationalist and you're an Anglican priest. Briefly, what's your view on whether creationists should be running schools?
I've no objection to creationists running schools, but the important thing is that in science lessons, creationism is not presented as valid science, because the reality is that it's only a minute minority of scientists who are comfortable with creationism. It's fine to discuss creationism in schools, and nearly always the best place to discuss it is in an RE lesson. In science,
Final word.
It's not a good idea to give the impression that we understand everything and know everything. Basically, we ought to present what's widely accepted and then encourage children to discuss with their uncertainties.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Briefly,
I mean, why do you object to his way of doing it?
Because science has always undergone paradigm shifts. There's always been lone voices. Stephen Hawking for 40 years had a theory about black holes which was the accepted norm. One man in California said, no, you're wrong. After 40 years, Stephen said, you know what, this guy's right.
Yes, but it's
always been a small number of people
Yeah.
have held out, and sometimes they've been right. And that happens because there's
scientific
allowed
consensus,
to have...
talking about Thomas Kuhn's theory of paradigm shifts in the history of science.
One second, George, let James answer.
Even he wouldn't recognise what you've just said. The theory of paradigm shift in the history of science is about the best available explanation of the observable evidence.
Yes, but
now, evolution is the best available explanation of
scientists
the
are
observable
created by
evidence.
God.
And to tie in with some of the other contributors, it was John Paul II who apologised posthumously to Galileo for rendering him a heretic for arguing that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. So just because something's been going on for hundreds of years doesn't mean it's right.
Exactly, and even if it's been going on for decades,
It's
it doesn't
about
mean
the
it's
observable
If God
evidence.
created
and more
man, he
evidence
created scientists.
needs to be discussed, and you
It
do it
does
in the
need to be
science
discussed.
in the science class.
George,
That's
thank
what I was
you.
asking for.
Thank you all very much for a very spirited discussion, if I may say so. Very briefly, a couple of your comments. Layla says, George needs to understand the nature of teaching. It's not about voicing your own opinion. It's about allowing young people to explore new ideas and make their own minds up. John says, I'm an engineer, but don't always believe science. Science has been proved wrong on various occasions. And Jean says, I think creationism should be taught in schools alongside Darwinism. I think it's foolish to teach one and not the other. Kids can then make up their own minds. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you to our contributors on webcam. Now, later on Sunday Morning Live,